So after playing through the bunny quest line in the first Descendant, I was thinking it's pretty cool that the devs gave us an entire quest line just to explain some of the characters' backstory, even if it was just the typical
5'4", black hair, never had her dad there.
Now I'll admit, this did leave me a bit hungry to understand a little bit more the plot of the other Descendants, and after barely reading one of these backstories, I was convinced these writers might be a part of the League of Villains, because some of these stories are just straight up diabolical. So grab your snacks and maybe a therapist and let's get into it. Kicking things off with number 1, we've got the Ice Queen herself, Viessa. Now Viessa's backstory was actually pretty cool, no pun intended, but before joining the Descendant Corp, she was basically Queen of the South Pole, doing some smuggling in the old frozen abandoned lands for a gang until eventually waking up the dead bride, which set off all the bells and whistles back in Albion. Now, obviously this meant that the Descendant Corp pulled up, and even though she did just help them beat a Colossus, they still decided,
"You're going to jail. You're going to jail."
But instead of making her serve the full 5 to 10, they gave her an option of parole, but she had to become a Descendant. So obviously she took that get out of jail free card and boom. That's basically how she ended up in Albion. Now for our next Descendant on the list, this is where the more intense backstories kind of start. And I'm talking about none other than our soldier boy Lepic. So much like his right arm, our boy Jonathan Lepic was once a part of something much bigger. That something bigger being the 44th Grenadier Squad, which unfortunately got wiped out doing an operation gone wrong. But thankfully for Lepic, the Magisters aren't like the government, and instead of just tossing him to the side, they gave him a brand new arcade drive prosthetic arm. Now this new arm did come with some slight risk, as it was originally designed for Descendants only, but thankfully Albion doesn't have pain meds, so upon installing this arm, it was so much pain that it literally awoken Johnny's arcade. And just like that, Jonathan, mostly Silverhand Lepic, was born. So chugging right along to the final of our starting 3, we have our vet, Ajax. Now, Lord Ajax's story starts pretty cool. He retired from active duty and could finally take up his dream job of becoming a professor at Albion's military academy. But sadly, that didn't last long, as he ended up getting a voice message from his old partner asking for some help.
And I miss you.
So Ajax did what any middle-aged professor would do in this situation. He hopped in his Mark V suit and went to the rescue. Now, this is when Ajax's story kinda goes into Interstellar meets Darling in the Franxx, because instead of just jumping into the void and finding Aisha, he ended up absorbing void energy and blacking out. But luckily Aisha's form found him and ended up triggering a return protocol which sent him back to the Descendant Zone. Now, what he thought was just a few days that he had spent in the void looking for her turned out to be a whole decade. Now, originally Alpha was like, "We're sending you back to the inner city schools," but Ajax was like, "Nah, I'm going back to the core." And that's basically it. That's how Ajax ended up becoming an active Descendant again. So, how are we feeling so far? Not too bad, right? Just a blonde ex-con, Jonathan Silverhand Lepic, and a professor that decided going to war was better than teaching. Nothing too crazy, right? Well, that's because this is where the real dark backstories begin. Now, to end on a somewhat positive note, I am going to run through these from most to least traumatic, if that's possible. Anyways, let's go. So to start this trauma show off, let's go with Mother Descendant Gley. So Gley's story is actually pretty messed up. Basically, her entire family had already died on the battlefield, and then her daughter Daya decided she wanted to go off on that same battlefield. So obviously Gley was like, there's no way I'm allowing this. So her daughter did what any kid would do when their parents tell them no, and they go ask their cousin. Well, not exactly her cousin, but more so her mom's old colleague, Ajax, for a recommendation letter to join the Corps. Now, this would play a pretty pivotal role in what would ultimately send Gley over the edge. As we fast forward a little bit, and Gley and her daughter Daya are sent out on a mission. And this did not go well, as both her and her daughter would end up being captured by the Order of Truth, and this is where things take a really dark turn, as both her and her daughter were subject to an experiment by the Order to, and I quote, inject Vulgus DNA into human bodies to create a new species. Now, I'm not gonna dive into that any further, but basically, Gley ended up blacking out from sheer rage, and by the time she calmed down, she had destroyed an entire ICU room and scared the life out of the medical core unit that had finally managed to find her. Now, this sheer rage was essentially Gley's Arche awakening, but upon hearing that her daughter's body was technically never recovered, she did slightly calm down and shift into the hopeful Gley that we know now that is still pursuing her daughter. So yeah, like I said, this backstory got really dark really fast, but we're gonna keep moving on. So number 6, or Freyna, the Toxic Queen, who was also part of the Special Forces alongside her lover, number 9, O'Neill. Wait a second. Pause. Number 6 and number 9? These writers. Anyways, basically 6 and 9, alongside 2 other special agents, were deployed to assassinate a priest of the Order of Truth, which did lead to some injuries, but everybody was able to make it back alive, and the mission succeeded. That was until they got inside Room 0. And that is where Freyna's story starts to get a whole lot more tragic. So, in the middle of a debrief, basically everyone except Freyna started to collapse, and eventually turned into Vulgus. And this did include number 9, so Freyna, forced to follow her orders of kill without hesitation, did what had to be done. So after pulling the trigger on her squad mates, she rushed over to O'Neill, who could barely say, "You must live," before rupturing into a mass of venomous spores. So frozen by sheer trauma of what she was witnessing, Freyna had to be pulled out of Room 0 by another officer that then locked the room off forever. As for Freyna, due to the sheer trauma and insomnia, her Arche kind of got really toxic, so she wound up having to be quarantined until they could find a neutralizer, which after they did meant that Freyna could finally leave quarantine and continue to fulfill that last request made by her now late lover. So moving on from our toxic queen to our monster energy king, we have Kyle. So Kyle was your typical construction corps worker who eventually made captain and was put in charge of the construction of the spectral digger in the Agna Desert. Now, all that work was pretty much going to plan, and eventually the construction was complete. Great news so far, right? Well, everyone was happy to have the job done and finally be able to return home. That was until the Legion of Darkness pulled up and said no Russian. Now, between watching his entire team get slaughtered and having to face the grim reality that he was probably next, that was enough for Kyle's Arche to finally get triggered and protect him from the rain of bullets. Now, after this, Kyle did what any Kyle would do. Lie to his superiors, hide his power, and stay in his room all day being emo. Now this lasted up until he found out that the Spectral Digger had now been taken over by the Vulgus, which was apparently enough for him to snap out of his emo state and decide to tell the truth and walk the path of a Descendant. So finally we're getting to the less traumatic backstories. Well, kind of. But anyways, time for the tale of our very own version of Atom Smasher, who is Sharen. So Sharen, our Agent Zero of the Special Forces, was pretty much built different from the start. She was considered to be the strongest non-descendant fighter with amazing stealth and melee skills. She even ended up killing more Vulgus than some of the more heavily armored Descendants at the time. But all of that kind of changed when she went to go track down a Borg Vulgus, and instead of waiting for backup, just decided to solo the job. Now this would ultimately cost her an arm and a leg, or both arms and legs. So after being ambushed by the Vulgus, she eventually woke up in an operating room to nothing but being just a torso, which was pretty freaking traumatic, as you can imagine. Now, luckily for her, she was able to use some of that pain and trauma to awaken her Arche and start to fuse with the new body prosthesis that was given to her as basically a last-ditch effort to save her life. Like, it was literally transplant organs or die. Now, during this entire fusion process, her body did start to basically grow back and replace itself with artificial muscle fibers and even a sick obsidian Kuiper frame. So, kinda traumatic, yes, but she got a fresh set of chrome and some awesome abilities. But, you know who else got some awesome abilities after dealing with trauma? Jayber. So unlike the other Descendants, Jayber's story starts in a hospital room because he was born with an infectious disease and was basically raised by his life support system, which eventually led him to have a deep connection with it. Now, fast forward a few years and he eventually modified the device to connect to Wi-Fi, and it only took him a few minutes of being connected to understand why the life support device was against connecting to the network. Now, I'm not sure which side of life leaks he ended up on, but apparently it was enough for him to give up hopes of a happy world and instead focusing on becoming a war machine. Now, aided by his brand new tech toys and the Magister's teaching, Jayber was able to go on and become an amazing support Descendant. Now, the real messed up part of his story is because apparently even after going on and proving himself to be a great Descendant, all because of his life support device and other tech that supported him, Jayber was viewed by the others as no different from just a machine, but he didn't really care because he only saw himself as just another unit for war. Now, moving on from one batch of childhood trauma to another, we have finally arrived at the fan favorite, Bunny. Now, Bunny's story is told a little bit through her quest line, but it focused more so on answering the questions about what happened to her parents, which basically disappeared after she turned 6. So, being raised by her grandmother and dealing with all the emotions of her parents leaving her behind, she turned to a life of crime, stealing weapons from Albion soldiers and selling them off in the black market in hopes of being able to make enough money to one day retire her grandmother, which was all and well until the day she stole some faulty grenades and had a close call with both the police and a rescue team. Now, this did eventually lead to Bunny's grandma trying to convince her to turn herself in, but sadly it was a little too late, as one of the grenades she stole, which was unironically a shock grenade, ended up malfunctioning and the timer started ticking down. Now, seeing it get very close to 0 triggered Bunny's last desire to live, and subsequently this triggered her arcade, which thankfully managed to cause a shockwave that prevented the grenade from going off inside the fuel depot and causing a major catastrophe. But the shock blast was still a little bit too much for Bunny, and she was left paralyzed. Now, stuck inside a hospital room, HQ was able to confirm Bunny's arcade activation, and they offered her a very similar deal to that of Viessa. Become a Descendant and we'll forget about your past crimes and even toss in a salary. Now, not only did this mean that Bunny would be able to run again, but she was also finally able to enjoy a happy dinner with her grandmother. So see, now we're getting to the more wholesome backstories, but obviously we can't just have 2 Descendants with childhood trauma, right? No. That is where our boy Esiemo comes in. See, Esiemo was the ultimate comeback kid. Bullied as a kid because apparently he smelled like gunpowder. But that was only part of his problems growing up, as eventually he started to have literal explosive allergies, which eventually led to his parents having to make a rough decision and report his RK to HQ, which ultimately led him to be taken away by a bomb squad and raised away from his parents to become a Descendant. And that's pretty much it. Esiemo actually accepted his fate pretty gracefully, and even went on to become the amazing explosive Descendant that we know now. So I guess the writers finally decided that at least someone could have 2 loving parents and a happy ending. Well, that was until I read up on our medic, Yujin. So, Yujin was a doctor at one of Albion's civilian hospitals, and eventually he got forced to become a combat medic after, and get this, his mom filled out and submitted an application to HQ for him without him knowing, which you can probably imagine, getting drafted into the military just because your parents signed you up did not go over well. But needless to say, this eventually led to quite a few mother-son arguments, even some which Gley herself couldn't even mediate. Now, this did eventually lead to Yujin going off and telling his mom that if she cared so much that she could treat him and that nothing seemed to satisfy her anyways. The teen rebel. But unfortunately, that ended up with him getting slapped and his mom leaving to go save more lives. Now, that slap wasn't the only thing that was going to hit him in the face that day, as shortly after their argument, he would get the news that many medical units, including his own mother, had died on the battlefield, which, upon learning about this, Yujin rushed to the battlefield and ended up having his own mother die in his arms, leaving him with one final message: You must do all you can for your patients until their last moment. Now, this, combined with later on having to help save his own commander Gley after she went missing for those few months, eventually led him to have an intense desire to save the lives of others, and that intense desire was all it took to awaken his Arche and eventually lead him to becoming a Descendant. Wow, alright, so we're finally almost done, and thankfully we are done with the darker side of Backstories. So now for our final three, Valby, Blair, and Enzo. Well, since only one of these are actually connected to another backstory, I'll start with him, so let's welcome our supply chief, Enzo. So yes, Enzo is actually Lepic's cousin, and was supposed to be in charge of supplying the 44th Grenadier Squad with munitions on the day that they got wiped out. But that's mostly because Enzo was in a hurry to save his only blood relative, and rushed off without a proper escort, which ended up with him getting in a similar situation as the 44th, and was ultimately ambushed, leading to an explosion and the destruction of the ammo. Now with the ammo gone, he was pretty much left thinking that the 44th and his cousin would be lost, which he was partially correct to that matter, but this deep sense of despair was enough to trigger his Arche, which allowed him to summon ammo from an Albion supply depot. However, Enzo was still a little bit unaware of exactly what was happening, but he just took it as a miracle, wiped out the enemies, and then tried to rush to the 44th's last known position. But unfortunately, as we do know from Lepic's backstory, the 44th had already perished, and Lepic had already lost an arm. Now, despite both Enzo and Lepic being able to carry on and become great descendants, Enzo still carried quite a bit of guilt from what happened that day, and this is pretty much displayed in his current actions and why he's so serious about making sure that no one ever goes without supplies again. Now moving on to another part of the military, we have our head chef Blair. Now Blair was pretty much like any military cook. He took great care of his job as he viewed it as serving troops who could be having their final meal any given day. But unbeknown to Blair, that any given day came a bit sooner as the Colossus, which possibly was pyromaniac, it wasn't ever clarified, appeared above an ingredient vault and pretty much bathed the area in flames. Now, after hearing about this, Blair joined up with the other Descendants in hopes of protecting at least some contents of the vault, but ultimately he himself would end up engulfed in flames. But this isn't the road for our head chef, as he rose like a phoenix from the ashes, grappled to the weak point of the Colossus, and used his newfound fiery powers to defeat the flaming Colossus. Now obviously after this, he had a clear choice to make.
Cook or arsonist?
In which he decided that becoming a Descendant could ultimately mean that his last suppers would no longer need to be cooked. Now moving on from one earth element, we have reached our final Descendant, the bubbly Valby. Now, as you might have guessed, Valby cares a lot about nature, hence why she was a member of the Environmental Watch, where she mostly spent her days traveling outside of Albion to investigate pollution around Ingress. Now, after seeing much of what was once White Knight Valley become what we know now as White Knight Gulch, as a result of Vulgus Kuiper mining, she thankfully eventually discovered one final sign of hope that was a lake near the Vespers woodland. But little did she know that lake would become so much more. See, as one day she was out just gazing over the lake, the Order of Truth appeared, and Valby, not being a Descendant yet, could only hold her ground against the Order of Truth for so long as she waited for backup to arrive. But sadly, backup would not get there in time, and Valby would suffer from her attacks and eventually get thrown into the lake, which led to a very Skyfall-style moment as she sank to the bottom.
Hold your breath and count to 10.
But as the last bit of her consciousness began to fade, her will to fight and drown the Vulgus led to the awakening of her Arche. Now this would lead to a massive wave erupting out of the lake and devastating the area, crushing the Vulgus in its path. And in the middle of that rose Valby, the last emerald of the Descendants. Well, we did it. We made it through all the stories of trauma, death, and pain of the Descendants that led to their each and own awakenings. Some far more traumatic than others, but nonetheless, they all have some interesting stories to tell. So I guess if you want to become a Descendant, just go through something really traumatic and have a near-death experience. Joking, obviously. If that were the case, I'm pretty sure we would all be Descendants by now.